welcome Sonja Hall, who is the Principal Official for Education at NASUWT. So that's the National Association of Schoolmasters Union of Women Teachers. So that's the full name. I don't know if I pronounced that well at all. Thank you, Sonja, for agreeing to tell us a little bit about your role and for the Neurodiversity in Education Conference. Very much appreciate that. For those who are watching this, my name is Dr. Anne-Marie O'Dwyer. I am one of the directors for Neurodiversity in Education. So, you know, at any time if you want to stop or you want to have a break, then just let me know, Sonja, and we'll just go through the questions in order as they were sent to you, and we'll just take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, if you're ready to start, Sonja, can you begin by explaining what your job involves and what a typical day looks like, if there is such a thing?
Right, okay. Yeah, I work in the education policy team at the NASUWT, and we're concerned with issues to do with teachers' professional practice. So that involves, and the areas of responsibility that I have include special educational needs. Although we are, as a team, we're quite a small team, there's 4 of us dealing with policy matters. We're generic, but we tend to pick up certain things. So I pick up special educational needs as it relates to learners and teachers' professional practice. I also tend to lead on AI and ed tech. I've been doing some work recently around teacher professionalism, teacher training and professional development. Also, the are issues that I've picked up. Inspection, Ofsted inspection and accountability are also things that fall within my remit. And curriculum, so you can see there's a lot of things that are coming up in the coming months that will be of particular relevance to the work that I do. And then also things to do with internationally. I represent NASUWT at the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, so things to do with PISA and actually other international evidence that links to teachers' professional practice. I would pick that up as well. So those are the areas. And in terms of the work that we do, we provide policy advice and analysis on those policy areas. And that would include providing advice and guidance to members and to NASUWT staff. So that could be the General Secretary. It could also be staff who are dealing with members and the queries that they have or the issues that are affecting them. And also representatives in regions and nations, we liaise with them quite closely. So, I mean, obviously, in terms of SEM policy, there are quite significant differences across the administrations of the UK. So others in the nations would tend to pick up those issues, but we would link in to make sure that there's a coherent approach. We also would be involved in seeking feedback from members and representatives, so that's in a responsive way and a proactive way. So that could be through the committees that we have. So there's an education committee, but it could be through surveys and dealing with queries as well. And then other things, we represent NASUWT at meetings. So for example, DFE on the areas that we're responsible for, Ofsted and other organisations that deal with education policy. And so that's really about getting updates and hearing what's actually happening, but also about seeking to influence or feedback our concerns or issues that we would want to be picked up in those policies. And then we also work with other unions and other organisations on issues of common concern. And I think in the context of special educational needs, it's worth flagging up the work that we do with the Special Education Consortium, SEC, which is a representative organisation, an organisation of over 40 members, and they represent a wide range of different stakeholders. But the SEC operates on the basis of consensus, and I think the key thing there is that unions are involved, but also organisations that support or represent the interests of children and young people and their families with special education needs and disabilities. So it's a valuable means of actually coming at particular issues, highlighting particular issues where we all come with a single voice, if you like. And then in terms of typical day work, I mean, it's things like attending meetings, which could be, most of them now are virtual, but that could be internal or external meetings. Dealing with policies, papers, materials, and reports, and also research reports. There's one bit about staying up to date, but it's also looking at and analysing, depending on whose material it is, and then using that to inform colleagues, but also our representatives, say like on the education committee, etc. And then producing advice and guidance for members, which typically we put on our website. Responding to queries which could come from individual members, but also from people in the regions. And then another dimension is responding to consultations, which could be like attending events in person, or it could be written consultation responses. So those are sort of some of the things that I would typically do in the course of a day.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds extremely broad. I'm going to pick up on one of those policy points. So in the creation of a special educational needs policy, if say for the example, the Department of Education wanted to bring in a policy, or there's a proposed policy change, what is your role in part of that?
Right. Okay. Well, I think the first thing is that NASUWT staff don't create the union's policy. That comes from our membership. So the policies of the union are actually established through our annual conference or through national executive agreeing positions between annual conferences. So it comes from the membership. There's also an important role for our advisory committees, and we have advisory committees for different groups of membership as well, and we hold consultation conferences for underrepresented groups, such as so that would be like women, Black teacher members, disabled members, young members, LGBTQ plus members, and that's a mechanism for getting feedback on the issues affecting them, as well as issues that they're experiencing. So the role of staff is to take that those agreed positions and to take the feedback, and actually then to be using that established policy positions and reflecting that through our responses. So if it was a DFE policy, we would be picking up the issues that members have been feeding into us through the committees or through individually contacting us, as well as agreed policy positions. So that's broadly it. But I think, I mean, in one sense, that sounds like we're just responding, but actually in practice, that can be quite a complex process. And you might sometimes be balancing bits and pieces of policy with, so you need to have that oversight. And actually, I've recently done some work around AI and ed tech, and I think that's quite useful as a means of illustrating how that can actually operate. One of the first pieces, and quite often as a team, we start by trying to develop principles to guide how we respond to things, and those principles are based on the various policy positions of the union. So in a sense, what we're trying to do there is to capture the range of factors that will be important in considering how we respond. So that will, if you're looking at a particular policy of the DFE, that we would be thinking of that from a principal point of view about the kinds of issues, as well as examples of the kinds of issues that would be relevant. And in terms of the AI and ed tech stuff, we've developed 12 principles, and they cover a range of issues around things like such as education as a public good and a human right, things around good working practice, so which are things around workload and teacher professionalism, and agency, equality and diversity matters, and things like data protection and the law as well. So there's a whole range of things, and just as an example around AI, it could be quite appealing in one sense as a means of reducing workload. A lot of the hype around AI is, or certainly those trying to sell products, are that it will reduce workload. But there's a risk associated with, if it does reduce workload, is it actually having an impact on other elements of what a teacher does and taking away core responsibilities, for example, and so potentially undermine teacher professionalism. So it's really about making judgments in a particular context about how you would actually respond. But all of those principles, you'd be having those in mind as how you would actually respond to a particular scenario.
Yeah, and actually just picking up, because I'm really interested with about the AI, because I know there's a kind of growing body of neurodivergent teachers using AI to kind of alleviate some of that stress that they're experiencing, because often they're working in environments that their neurodivergence isn't recognised, or there isn't any clear policy that's directed for, or is clear for members of staff. There may be policy for students. So just interested in that in terms of the NASUWT's position on the teachers using AI in terms of their own creation. I mean, it's an interesting one, because I know of a number of teachers myself. Actually, I've just started to use AI, and it's really relieved some of the burden that I used to experience. So yeah, just interested on that position.
I mean, I think that our position, we've got the principles, and we've also got guidance on establishing collective agreement, and that draws on things and also sets out some red lines. And I think one of the challenges is that actually whether it's good or bad or appropriate or not will depend on context. And I think that's where the principles are so key. So about the teacher being in control and teachers having agency. And in terms of the use, I mean, we wouldn't have a blanket position saying no, it's bad, or yes, it's good, because it does depend so much on the individual. And we would want to see the teacher, the individual. I mean, there might well be policies within a school about if you're working collaboratively with colleagues, that you might need to come to some sort of position. But there are approaches to using AI that certainly are advocated in other union settings internationally, where it is focused on the user and what their needs are. And so there are examples of in some settings where some will make extensive use of AI and others not, and actually it needs to support whatever you do. And for some teachers, it may not be appropriate, it may not work for them. I think that's the key point. So, but it's about working and it being used to support teachers. And there are some attempts to do that, or certainly that's what some people claim. I think the question is, it's not clear, and that's where we need feedback from people about how it works. And what works for them. And I think in terms of large language models, for example, certain programs might like ChatGPT might work for certain types of subjects, but maybe not so well for others. And maths, although I heard this week there's been an updated version, I think the feedback suggests that previously it's not been so strong in terms of like the maths dimensions, but it might work better in other scenarios. And certainly we did some training for some of our members earlier in the year, and the trainer was a teacher educator, and she was using it in her teaching practice. In her teacher education, and she was using ChatGPT, and she was very much of the approach that it's for the individual student trainee to be determining in whether it's relevant for them, but it's about opening up the possibilities. But also I think the other critical thing is about being alert to the risks as well, and so that's the key thing. It's not just about what's an opportunity, it is about weighing it up and looking at different sort of scenarios. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think probably then that, you know, in terms of the individual, like going down to the kind of school or the college or the university level, you can have an AI policy, but then it's important to have a certain protocol in terms of
Yeah.
how, you know, a procedure of how it should be used, and recognizing that it could be, you know, can be used as an accessibility tool, so not to shut it down.
Absolutely.
But also we don't want to, you know, it be used as another kind of resilience strategies, because those neurodivergent workforce are not getting any support. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And
yeah,
I think a key thing is about engagement of staff and the diversity of staff. So for us, that would be an absolutely critical point about,
yeah,
you know, how a decision's made and who's involved in making those decisions. So there will be one element about the union involvement and but also seeking feedback and actively using that feedback from, you know, the range of people who might be using the technology or, you know, have interactions with the technology. So yeah.
yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And then in terms, because you we were just discussing about this, the SEM policy and the SEM policy creation, that the consultation process, particularly if it was something like a big piece of consultation that you do in the Department of Education, is it's quite nuanced, isn't it, in terms of how it kind of plays out. But in terms of, and it's really good to hear that in terms of the union's own policy or its policy position, that's very much fed up, for want of a better word, from the members. That's really good. That's kind of positive to hear. And if you were part of a big consultation, what are the kind of main factors do you think that influence that final policy position? Is there a sense that union feedback has some weight in that consultation process?
Yeah, I think that depends on who's doing the consultation, and I think certainly recently there's been a feeling that consultations with the previous government, the consultation process and involvement in unions was, you know, very limited, and actually they were, you know, there was a chosen group of people who were influencing and feeding into the development of whatever policies were planned, but unions weren't actively involved. And I mean, our hope is that under the Labour government, I mean, certainly the messages are that they want to work with unions and they want a sort of a social partnership model. So hopefully that will actually lead to something much more productive in the longer term, because obviously if you've got involvement in unions and actually getting views from people on the ground, you're going to be picking up the problems and actually better able to respond to issues. So and I mean in terms of policy developments, there are lots of different things that will come into play. So and I mean in that instance, I mean government ideology will impact on who's involved and how they're involved. But yeah, I mean, having mechanisms for involving a significant number of people will help to ensure that policy, you know, there's the organisation developing the policy, the government is actually aware of what the limitations are and what barriers need to be overcome, you know, in order to implement it effectively.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just kind of leading on from that. So what I mean, this can be because you've extended in terms of the policy that you're responsible for. So you can select from the areas that you manage of policy how you want to answer it. But what challenges do you anticipate for the future of it can be SEND support in schools and colleges in England, or it can be what might be the challenges in terms of teacher professional development, particularly for neurodivergent teachers. So look, you know, I'll leave you to select which you want. You know, what might be the challenges.
Actually, I mean, if I focus on SEND support, but I think the thing I would say is that a lot of the policies are interconnected. So part of the challenge in terms of trying to address a SEND policy is that to be effective, government needs to be addressing other things as well. And so, I mean, in terms of challenges, I mean, you indicated that you were going to be asking a question in this sort of area. So, I mean, I don't think it will be any surprise to people that, you know, our view is that the range of challenges are huge, but things like lack of funding. So, you know, the government may have aspirations to make improvements, but funding is going to be an issue in terms of addressing that effectively. Lack of resources is also an issue, and that's, you know, over the last 14 years there's been huge cuts in resourcing, so that leads to greater pressures on all elements of the system, but certainly schools that, you know, taking the brunt of it, you know, with the pupils. And actually, if you look at it from the point of view of SEND reform, one of the issues is that if there are pressures, then typically the focus is on just meeting the kind of basics or the statutory elements. So if reform is going to be effective, that needs to shift to earlier intervention and to prevention. But how you actually do that in the context of those limitations is a huge challenge. And I mean, we would recognise that there are inefficiencies in the system, and that there are some authorities that are operating in a very inefficient way and spending huge great sums of money in not the most effective ways. So there is a need to be addressing things there, but, you know, some of the programs such as Safety Valve and Delivering Better Value, we think, or we have significant concerns and sort of anecdotal evidence to indicate that the pressures are such that, you know, basically it's about actually even cutting what is statutory provision, and so controlling that. And then another challenge as well is around the loss of specialist expertise. So cuts over the last 14 years have meant that, you know, in local authorities, many of the experts have gone. So if you don't have those experts, you can't simply just, you know, go back to pre-2010. And I mean, there were huge issues with the system then, but in terms of resourcing, you can't simply go back. And I think another element in terms of SEN support and where the ambition, and in terms of that green paper, we supported the ambition of a more inclusive system, but actually how you get to it is the issue, and recognizing the barriers and the factors that need to be addressed in doing that. But that the existing system is based on a medical model, and the assumption underpinning perhaps that ambition was something of a social model, and that's radically different, and the structures and aren't in place to facilitate that. And also, it isn't just looking at SEND, it's looking, so coming back to the point about looking at other areas, I mean, how teacher training addresses SEND, how mainstream policies, and so curriculum reform, for example, is quite a good one here, how actually that at the moment probably adds to the problems in terms of you know, the challenges for some children with special educational needs, and also for schools in terms of you know, supporting those students and actually getting recognition for the work that they're doing. So there's a need to be looking at mainstream policies and actually embedding things around equality, diversity, inclusion within mainstream policy development, design and development, rather than just focusing on looking at SEND. And actually, if you're just looking at SEND, then you're looking at you're addressing the issue as a bolt-on and an add-on. So I think that's a big problem for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to kind of really extend that further, looking at, you know, teacher professionals, that you've got the teacher training and certainly my own experience, I hope it's different now. When I trained back in 2003, 2004, that the practical element of my teacher training didn't have any provisions in place that the trainee teacher could be neurodivergent, so there wasn't anything, even, I mean, obviously that language wasn't used then, it was very much biomedical model, but they didn't have anything in terms of any consideration that they might have a teacher with the language, that if we use the language from the biomedical model of that might have a specific learning difference, such as dyslexia, dyspraxia. And when I actually raised that, that was seen, there was like real shock about that there could be a teacher. And if we think about, I don't think things have drastically moved on. Certainly.
No, and I think I would share that concern. I mean, what you've got is an atomization of the system. And so although there have been some very recent changes in terms of bringing together the Common Core framework and early career framework, so there's with a view to improving how they address SEN, but that's SEN as it relates to learners. I think the way in which teacher training is provided there's so much more flexibility and interpretation, I think, actually at local level, that I think that the concerns you've raised there are likely to still be very prevalent, to be frank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have that, once the teacher is in practice, you've got the whole, with the Ofsted framework. I looked at the recent guide. I cannot see any acknowledgement that there might be, again, teachers themselves who might be ADHDers, or they might have they're autistic, or they're dyspraxic, or they've got post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no recognition of neurodivergence in the framework. So
I think actually that framework, although they talk about teacher workload and well-being, I mean, it's not clear in terms of the changes around ungraded inspection. I attended some inspector training last week. So the messages there are there's kind of a bit of a mixed message, actually, because it was an area of focus. Well, actually, area of focus rather than deep dive is what they're using now. But there were points that inspectors were supposed to be focusing on as part of an ungraded inspection, and one of those was around workload. I mean, we had concerns about the extent to which that was taken up. They've removed that requirement to be doing that now, but they are expected to still be doing it. So it's a kind of a mixed message there. And I think the concern is there's a shift in terms of the ungraded inspection at the moment, and then what happens in a year's time, or potentially possibly longer. But there's a shift towards more emphasis on the professional dialogue with the school leadership. So that does not necessarily look, and I think from our point of view, probably our concern is that they, in many instances, they will not look critically at how leaders engage and actually listen to and take account of the needs of teachers and other members of staff. So I think there are big concerns about how this is all going to pan out. I mean, in terms of inspection, we've got huge concerns about inspection from the point of view of it being located within a high stakes accountability system, and that drives practice as well as what Ofsted does. So there are a number of factors that would be at play there. But I suspect, I mean, if I was to give some recognition to inspectors, what they're being asked to do within 2 days is probably unrealistic to expect them to do anything of any depth. There's the other point. So it's, the idea that they would even have time to look at these issues in a meaningful, critical way. I think you've got to question that as well. So so it's more about the system, inspection system there, rather than I mean, there are huge issues with some inspectors, so there's that as well. But what's being asked of inspectors is probably unrealistic as well.
Yeah, absolutely, because that obviously that drives the culture and behaviour in schools and colleges. And I mean, you know, that, I mean, that's the issue, because it drives that culture, so that when you have things like, you know, even like training days, and that it's all very much geared towards the accountability, meeting those kind of the accountability framework.
I
And
mean, there are quite a lot of questions around the quality of training and professional development, and I mean, the time that is available or not available to actually undertake meaningful quality professional development, and then who has access to it as well. You know, so I think there are lots of issues there in terms of how, and that comes in part as well to how the role of the teacher is defined, or the expectations about that role. And for us, in terms of addressing professionalism, part of it is actually looking at that and building in things around time to actually undertake meaningful professional development and learning, and that would be in part about collaboration as well, not just you know, and teachers having a very active role in determining what they need, rather than it just being sort of imposed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think then just thinking then, so how does the union then assist head teachers in, you know, what are the guidance that they provide for members in terms of how they can fulfill the public sector equality duty of the Equality Act? So is there guidance about?
Yeah, we do have guidance, and that would be for teachers and for leaders and for reps. And so yeah, I mean, it's about being transparent about clear about that expectation around the public sector equality duty, but actually, you know, in terms of the role that we do in the education policy team, we're not explicitly focusing just on, well, equality matters are embedded in how we approach things, but it's not, you know, we're not necessarily producing the guidance on the public sector equality duty, although I've done stuff in the past because my background's in equalities one. But it's making sure that it's fed through the policies and the principles. So actually it should be in the thinking and therefore in at the initial stages. And there are some core things around, I mean, obviously looking at the law and actually making sure you comply is one bit, but there are kind of approaches to how you operate. So things like impact assessments. So, and if I go back to the AI stuff, there, you know, there are requirements around data protection and impact assessments, but also, you know, linking those to things around workload and equality would be key as well. And the key about impact assessments is it's about the start of the process. So, you know, it's about trying to identify that initial evidence base in terms to influence how, you know, the kinds of things that are focused on in terms of a policy or a piece of, you know, how you approach practice. So there's that, and part of that as well is about engaging and talking to and seeking the views of, and actually using that evidence to, you know, to identify the issues and influence how you approach things. So I think, you know, it's so if the difference between, say, our team and perhaps the equality and training team, who obviously have equality within their brief as an explicit thing, you know, they might be writing the bits of paper, the bits of guidance to explain equalities legislation, but we would be putting that into practice through the ways in which we would produce our advice and guidance, you know, and what we would say, and the kinds of ways we would be trying to reflect, you know, what should be done.
Yeah. And then do you have, are there examples of a good practice from members who've said, okay, at my plate, you know, at the school where I teach or that I'm head of, that we put this in place in terms of meeting I always find the specific duty of the public sector equality duty is because it's mainly data driven, but the more kind of general duty, it was less, it was less obvious where that was being put into place. When I, carried out my research, it seemed to be that what was happening is that the colleges that I spoke to were taking from the policy for students around additional support and then trying to apply that to teachers, and it was done such on an ad hoc basis. So it's interesting to know if
I think
members have examples, have come to you with either good or said, actually, I'm really struggling at where I work because they're not actually meeting the general duty of the.
to be honest, we don't really get people coming to us saying that. I think the observation is, if you look at what's being done, as you describe, it's very ad hoc, and that's the real challenge. I mean, I used to work, before I went to NASUWT, I worked at the Commission for Racial Equality, and I was working on the race equality duty as it was then. And I think it is equality issues are addressed in a very ad hoc way, and then and although there were specific duties, the concern was and still is that, and actually there's more freedoms now to interpret and just pick things, cherry picking, if you like, what you're going to focus on. What was underpinning and what's in the general duty is it's about a different way of working. It's thinking quite differently about how you actually approach things, and in a sense, who's involved in the decision-making processes. You actually need to be starting from a different standpoint. And if you don't, then it becomes quite a bureaucratic exercise. And I don't think there's the commitment from many organisations to do things properly around that. Or even to stand back and think about that. But that's where working in a mainstream policy role is actually quite useful, because you can be feeding things through and trying to encourage some of those ways of working. And so that's going back to the difference between us and the equality and training team. That's what I would sort of say I would identify with. It is about trying to put some of those kind of principles into guidance on practice. But I think the reality is there's a huge challenge. There are individual schools that will be doing good things, and as always, but it's a huge challenge, and I think how often they're working in spite of policy, wider policy.
Yeah, absolutely, because it goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of, there are tensions between the kind of accountability culture that's very much evident in education. And I mean, it's always been there, but it seems to have certainly in the last 10 or, as you said, like 15 or so years, it seems to picked up that accountability and that, that kind of performative measurements, outputs, determining. So the focus seems to be more on proof of something rather to improve.
Yeah, that's right. So compliance, being led by compliance rather than actually understanding, the spirit. The general duty is almost about the spirit, and actually that's what you're trying to get to. But actually, the focus is what do we need to do to comply, and actually in some instances they don't even bother to do that, is the reality. But
it's difficult because of all the other tensions. Now that's brilliant. I mean, I've come to the end of the questions. I wanted to go with the flow of our conversation, and that's been really helpful because it's going to give it a nice kind of insight into the policy process, and in terms of how policy comes about, but also there's some of those challenges and tensions. And I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to kind of add, or anyone watching this. So it's part of the Neurodiversity in Education Conference, and we're going to have teachers. I say teachers, but we're going to have teachers, researchers, compulsory. We're going to have. We've also got representation from prison education as well. So we're trying to do the kind of a broader sense when we're looking at the education sector. So there are going to be teachers out here that are going to be watching it in a broader sense. I'm using the word teacher, and I don't know if you've got any kind of final passing comments in terms of that they can, I suppose, advocate for themselves, or how they can work with their union, or just
I think that's the general point about working collectively and
yeah,
with others is probably the most powerful way, and it's about
yes,
making sure that you're actually listened to and heard.
yeah,
And I mean, certainly using NASUWT as an example, I mean, we do have a very clear commitment to equality threaded throughout all of that we do. I mean, our general secretary, his background is an equalities one, as well, and so there is an absolute commitment, and through the work, all of the work of the organisation, the
yeah,
union, to actually ensure that and to respond to trying to identify, actively engage, diversity of membership in all the union structures, and actually to reflect and to be picking up the issues that affect them. So getting involved and actually if you have an issue, going to your union is absolutely critical. Because that's the way in which you're likely to get to be able to challenge and change things.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Sonja. That's
Okay.
been excellent. I'm sure it's going to be very valuable to anyone who watches this, and I hope you have a look and join us. We've got all of the
Yeah.
sessions will be recorded, apart from we will be running a session for a support group session for neurodivergent teachers. That's the only one that won't be. But thank you very much. Thank you.